In the twilight of the 26th century, Earth was a relic on the galactic periphery, scrappy, chaotic, and poor in the eyes of the Concordance of Lawful Species. The Concordance, a coalition of over 70 civilizations bound by millennia of jurisprudence, recognized sapient rights, trade protocols, and territorial limits only if codified by the Lex Absoluta, a living treaty framework older than most stars. Humanity, uninvited and uninitiated, was tolerated as a curiosity, a bickering species too young to comprehend interstellar law and too disorganized to pose a threat. That perception began to change the day Earth transmitted its declaration of galactic legal status to the Concordance's Court of Species standing, not through diplomatic channels but as a blind legal challenge. The document, written by an obscure Terran named Adrien Solari, cited Concordance precedent, constructed analogues from Earth's own fragmented legal history, and accused a dozen member races of unlawful seizure of Sol system mining rights. The court dismissed it with a scathing commentary. But the text spread, and what began as laughter turned to unease. Adrien Solari had no formal authority. He was not backed by Earth's fragmented council governments or the limping United Planetary Coalition. He had never even left Earth, but Solari was a practitioner of law as Earth had forged it, adversarial, innovative, ruthless. In a galaxy of ceremonial courts and ritual precedents, Solari saw opportunity in chaos. He began to work cases, not in courtrooms, but in the ruins of Earth's shattered legal institutions, across bandwidths, archives, and xenolinguistic data troves. He found migrant humans being exploited in alien labor systems, unacknowledged border violations by minor Concordance members, and one instance where a Cavaran fleet destroyed an unregistered Terran station and claimed preemptive risk mitigation as defense. Solari gathered all of it. He filed appeals. He tracked the arguments into the labyrinthine recesses of galactic protocol, cited ancient maritime law, and weaponized clauses even Concordance judges had long forgotten. He did not win at first, but he forced them to answer. The first minor victory came in the case of Elru v. Terran exiles, where Solari argued that indenture contracts imposed on human refugees violated the Third Covenant of sentient labor. The Elru, a species of crystalline arbitrators, had been thought unimpeachable in legal matters, yet they had crafted the contracts in haste, assuming humans incapable of legal recourse. When Solari exposed procedural errors, conflicting timelines, and forced declarations of assent, the court could not ignore the implications. The Elru were forced to void the contracts and pay restitution. The ruling caused a tremor across the Concordance. A precedent had been set, one that humans could use. What followed was not a war, but something more insidious. Other Concordance members began deploying lawyers of their own, offering settlements with barbed terms, masking colonial ambitions under regulatory language. Treaties were dangled before Earth's factions like gifts, offering protection, resource rights, or limited autonomy in exchange for obeisance. Most Terran leaders, desperate for survival, accepted. But Solari did not. He began a campaign he called the Codex Reversal. He took the treaties signed by Earth's desperate governments and interpreted them not as submission, but as opportunity. Using the language of those agreements, he began filing injunctions, building interstellar arbitrations, and invoking binding clauses against the very powers who had issued them. The Concordance dismissed him again, until the shackles he was forging began to tighten. On Mars, when the Trinaxis Tribunal tried to confiscate helium-3 wells under the Resource Stabilization Clause, Solari presented evidence that their own interpretation of stabilization required shared management. The tribunal's own trade laws backed his assertion. Forced into compliance, they withdrew. On Europa, a minor Concordance species attempted to relocate an undersea human settlement, citing safety regulations. Solari unearthed a long-buried Concordance ruling affirming colonial continuity rights. The forced relocation was halted. He earned enemies. High lawgivers from across the Concordance convened. Solari's name was cited in emergency policy meetings. An entity dismissed as a legal oddity had become a strategic threat. Some urged for his assassination, others argued for economic pressure, but the Concordance was bound by law. To silence Solari without due cause would threaten their own legitimacy. So they tried a different tactic. They invited him. A summons came encoded in an iron scroll datawave sealed with the sigils of the 9 adjudicating houses. It offered Solari a place among them as a lawkeeper, a ceremonial role, lucrative, prestigious. They hoped to neutralize him through status. He refused. Instead, he filed a case. It was the first planetary-scale filing ever attempted by a non-member species. The case, Solari v. Concordance Provisional Protections Treaty, accused Concordance signatories of predatory legal imposition, deceptive treaty framing, and exploitation of asymmetric legal literacy. He named 14 species as co-defendants. The Concordance laughed again. But the filing had standing. Solari had manipulated the treaty acceptance protocol using language inserted during a failed amendment 3 centuries prior. It rendered the Provisional Protections Treaty contestable under certain asymmetrical conditions, and Solari had documented all of them. Now the court had to hear it. Terran Space watched breathlessly. The case would take months. During that time, Solari traveled first by proxy avatars, then physically. He met with human settlements under Concordance control, interviewed alien jurists, and traced obscure precedent across 10 civilizations. He learned their philosophies, their blind spots, their vanities. He was not alone. A growing cadre of human legal minds began to gather around him: students, dissidents, exiled advocates, even a few AI consensus nodes that had survived the data collapse. Together, they became known as the Treaty-born. They did not just study law, they forged it anew. But even as Solari advanced, Concordance forces tightened their grip on humanity. Economic sanctions were imposed, trade lines were severed, surveillance increased on every human colony. Treaties once meant to protect were now used to justify repression. The irony was not lost on Solari. The shackles he had built were closing, but not only on the Concordance. He knew what had to come next. To break the chains, he would have to shatter the treaties themselves. But to do that, he would need something no Terran had ever possessed in the eyes of the Concordance: sovereignty. And the only way to get it was to make the Concordance give it to him. By their own laws. By their own hands. Solari's petition for sovereign recognition, filed under Article 771 of the Concordance Lex Absoluta, sent shockwaves through the adjudicative strata. No non-member species had ever invoked Article 771, most didn't even know it existed. Buried within the millennia-old framework, it allowed a legal ascension if a claimant could prove that an emerging civilization had achieved not technological parity, but jurisprudential equivalence. It was a trap the Concordance had laid centuries earlier, confident it would never be used. But Solari had mapped every inch of the clause, and now he dared the galaxy to deny humanity under its own sacred code. The Concordance had no choice but to answer. A trial was convened on Syrian Hal, the Judicatrix world, a moon-turned courthouse the size of Earth's moon, where atmospheres were artificially tuned to accommodate over 70 sentient species. The proceedings were set in the Axis Chamber, a place where wars had been averted and empires sanctioned through nothing but words. This would be the site of the most audacious legal maneuver in Concordance history. The day Solari arrived, the chamber fell into murmurs. He came not in robes or augmented form, but in a charcoal suit from Earth's prefusion era. Unadorned, unsanctioned, and alone, save for one aide, a silent augmented child named Kale, born from an Earthside data refuge. Kale never spoke but recorded and processed everything, eyes reflecting glyphs from a dozen alien dialects. The case began with Concordance counsel Rovell, a four-limbed judicial from the Vothic courts, attempting to dismiss the petition on grounds of cultural invalidity. She argued that humans lacked a unified planetary governance structure and had demonstrated legal inconsistency across territories. Solari countered with filings documenting legal pluralism as a strength, not a flaw. He cited the Hreshti's own fractured tribunal system and even forced a Vothic witness to admit their jurisprudence was built on regional contradiction. The chamber stirred uneasily. 3 days into testimony, Solari called his first witness, a sentient asteroid protocol intelligence named Varex Gay, who had mediated asteroid belt disputes between the Karkath and the Un for over 5 centuries. Under oath, Varex Gay confirmed that Solari's filings had forced concordant reevaluation of over 19 prior cases, a feat unprecedented even among Concordance members. Then came the treaty analysis phase. This was Solari's battlefield. For weeks he dissected the Concordance Provisional Protections Treaty, clause by clause. He demonstrated how the phrasing of protections masked economic subjugation, how the integration of alien oversight agencies violated their own statutes of territorial autonomy, and how legal aid provided by Concordance judges had served to enforce exploitation, not prevent it. He offered thousands of pages of annotated cross-species law. He presented reconstructed legal histories, leveraging parallels between Earth's colonial past and Concordance mechanisms. He drew lines between human suffering and judicial structure so elegantly that the Axis Chamber, used to dry abstractions, sat in silence more than once. But the Concordance was not idle. During a recess, Earth's colony on HD 1776C was invaded by a security force from the Telor Dominion. The Telor claimed enforcement of a Concordance Code violation linked to environmental mismanagement. Solari immediately filed a war crime suit, accusing the Telor of exploiting the legal ambiguity of enforcement jurisdiction to justify a military seizure. The emergency session forced Concordance magistrates to demand the Telor withdraw, citing ongoing adjudication. The Treaties, now numbering in the hundreds, began opening regional offices across Solari-controlled bandwidths. They translated filings into dozens of languages, started issuing advisory opinions for other minor species, and found themselves flooded with requests for legal guidance. It was no longer just about humanity. Solari had created something larger, a network of legal insurgency, a challenge not only to Concordance authority but to its idea of law itself. Then came the counterattack. Late into the third month of trial, Solari was served with a multilateral sanctionary action, a complex motion accusing him of weaponizing lawfare and destabilizing galactic order. It came backed by 23 Concordance member states. The penalty, if accepted, would result in permanent banning of Terran filings, confiscation of Mars orbital habitats, and the formal reclassification of humanity as a pre-civil species. The chamber turned against him, witnesses withdrew, judges looked to the floor. It was over, they thought. Until Solari stood, motioned to Kale, and revealed his final argument. The augmentation protocols of Article 992. It had never been used, a dead clause buried in the Lex Absoluta. It allowed a non-member species to represent other non-member species if it could prove jurisprudential capacity to act as a legal intermediary. Solari was not defending humanity alone. He was filing on behalf of 37 minor species, traders, exiles, worker castes, and lost diasporas who had quietly joined the Treaties. And he had their signed authorization. The room exploded. What had begun as a Terran plea for recognition was now a coalition. Legal, documented, bound by Concordance law. The Lex Absoluta required that all members recognize such an intermediary. To deny it would be to deny their own foundational code. The tribunal demanded a recess. For 2 days there was silence across Concordance space. No statements, no rulings, just broadcasts of the same image across Terran and Concordance systems, Adrien Solari standing with the scrolls of recognition glowing behind him. But Solari knew this was only a pause. Outside the courts, Concordance fleets began to mobilize. Communications between member states intensified. There were whispers that if the legal route could not contain Earth, then the laws themselves might need to be rewritten or destroyed. The Treaties went underground, secure servers were moved to microwarp nodes, some operatives were arrested, others vanished. On Earth, signs of orbital surveillance increased, the shadow of force crept closer. Yet in the Axis chamber, the game was not finished. Solari returned with a new filing. He was invoking juris nullis, the right of self-revocation. A clause that allowed a species to reject all Concordance legal authority, if they could prove they had been systematically manipulated into subservience through legal deceit. If successful, Earth would not merely be recognized. It would secede from Concordance legal dominion. In the treaties, the very shackles Solari had twisted into weapons would be shattered not by war, not by rebellion, but by legal precision so perfect it would unmake the chains themselves. The final ruling was set to be issued within a single orbital cycle. A cycle that would change everything. The Concordance did not issue its ruling on time. A solar cycle passed, then another. Messages from the Axis chamber stopped flowing. Court nodes across the Treaties network went dark. When communication resumed, it was filtered, partial, and clearly censored. No announcement was made. The ruling on juris nullis remained pending. Adrien Solari understood immediately. They were stalling, not because they needed time to decide, but because they couldn't afford to. A successful invocation of juris nullis would rupture centuries of Concordance precedent. If one species could reject the law itself through legal channels, others would follow. The structure that had bound the galaxy in cold stability would begin to unravel. The Concordance, for all its ancient decorum, had reached its true boundary, the limit of control masquerading as order. And so they delayed, hoping pressure would break the challenger. It nearly worked. Within weeks, multiple human colonies came under blockade. Earth itself faced cascading trade embargoes. Artificial famines were triggered not by war but by denied shipments of fusion catalysts and biosphere regulators. Concordance diplomats framed these moves as discretionary enforcement of regulatory compliance. Terran infrastructure began to crack. One by one, Earth's fractured governments issued statements distancing themselves from Solari. The Atlantic Federation condemned his tactics as irresponsible escalation. The Martian Assembly voted to begin compliance talks with concordance liaisons. Even the Lunar Free Consortium, one of Solari's early backers, withdrew its support. But Solari had prepared for this. He summoned the Treaty-born not to the Axis chamber, but to a place no concordance judge had ever entered. Ceres Station, an independent outpost buried in the asteroid belt, controlled by rogue engineers, miners, and data weavers, humans with no allegiance to any planetary power. Here, he unveiled what he had been building in secret. A parallel legal system. Not a mimicry of the concordance, not a rebellion, something new. He called it the Covenant of Emergent Jurisprudence. And it began not with law, but with consent. Where concordance law was immutable, the covenant was adaptive. Where the lex absoluta required centuries of precedent, the covenant allowed dynamic restructuring by living consensus. Where concordance treaties shackled through subtlety, the covenant demanded clarity of obligation and mutual comprehension, regardless of species or structure. And he had more than ideas, he had membership. The 37 species who had filed through him agreed to join the covenant, some through desperation, others through belief. Together, they signed the founding Accord of Ceres. The event was broadcast via a spectrum burst across unfiltered channels. In one pulse, a new legal body was born. The concordance reacted with fury. It declared the covenant illegal under galactic unity statutes. Orders were issued to arrest Solari and any who declared affiliation. Naval assets began shifting toward the inner Sol system. A quiet war loomed. But Solari had a final card. Kale, the silent child at his side, had not been a passive observer. They were an artifact of something older, born from the remains of Earth's failed presentient AI legislation and refined in the shadows of data exile. Over the years, Kale had absorbed every argument, every contradiction, every line of law rendered or broken. And Kale had learned. Now, under Solari's direction, Kale was released into the concordance public data stream, not as a virus, but as a mirror. Kale began to debate. In forums on archival threads within internal concordance simulations, Kale's avatars began raising objections, citing precedent, and forcing counterarguments in real time. Concordance judges found themselves arguing with something that knew their history better than they did. Every response Kale received was archived, indexed, and compared against past judgments. Discrepancies were exposed, bias patterns emerged, cases thought buried resurfaced with damning clarity. Inconsistencies were not just pointed out, they were proven publicly undeniably. The very legitimacy of concordance rulings began to erode, not by violence or uprising, but through relentless intellectual precision. One by one, cracks formed. The Atren magistrates quietly voted to allow limited covenant recognition within their trade zones. The Lasari exarchate, long hostile to Earth, abstained from a motion condemning Solari, citing insufficient procedural grounds. Even within the concordance core, dissension spread. Minor judges began resigning, some fled. And then came the signal. A blind comms burst from the Axis chamber, encoded in a format only Treaty-born systems would recognize. It was simple. You have made your case, convene for ruling, 7 cycles. 7 cycles, 1 final trial. Ceres Station went silent, preparations began. Solari selected his witnesses carefully, not humans, but alien scholars, persecuted workers, and exiled diplomats who had used covenant law to resolve disputes the concordance ignored. One of them was a biological cloudform from the Enrethi Drift, who had mediated a 20-species resource accord using Solari's protocols. Another was an abandoned biomechanical judge from a collapsed concordance vassal state, who now acted as an arbiter under covenant governance. Each would testify, not for humanity, but for the future of law. The day of return arrived. This time, Solari did not walk into the Axis chamber alone. He entered bearing the Covenant's charter, flanked by 37 representatives. Each one bore a sigil designed by their own kind, representing their own principles, now codified in the Covenant's adaptable code. The judges were assembled, 65 of them, and for the first time in memory, some were not concordance-born. By law, they had to hear it. The ruling would be decided not by consensus, but by challenge. A live procedural contest, ancient and nearly forgotten, where advocates from each side would test the limits of their arguments in the presence of the primordial axiom. a transsentient arbiter so ancient its judgments could not be revoked, only recorded. Solari would argue first. He spoke for 3 hours, no flourishes, no drama, just the truth of law made by those without power and how it could become the engine of emancipation or tyranny. He did not defend Earth. He exposed the lie that law was immutable, that justice came only through tradition. He said one sentence that would be quoted for decades after. "You built treaties to bind us but forgot that chains have weight, and we learned to wield them." The Concordance responded, led by Rovell once more. Her tone had shifted. She did not deny Solari's charges. Instead, she claimed that stability required inequality, that survival demanded stratification, and that the Concordance had preserved peace longer than any other form of governance. She ended with a warning. "Break this system and you will not inherit peace. You will ignite entropy." And then it was done. The primordial axiom spoke, not in words, in meaning. Law is not what survives, it is what adapts. The ruling was simple. Juris nullius was upheld. The Provisional Protections Treaty was voided. Humanity and the Covenant were declared self-sovereign under binding interstellar law. The Concordance had not been overthrown. It had been outlawed. The ruling detonated across the galactic net like a slow-burning nova. At first, there was no official Concordance response. Just silence, as if the ruling itself could be buried under the inertia of centuries, but silence did not stop the Treaty-born, nor did it slow the Covenant. New signals poured in from species who had never dared speak under the old order. Fragmented cultures, broken polities, hybrid sapients exiled from pure-aligned systems, they all sent emissaries, each bearing grievances long denied by the Concordance courts. And more than that, they brought law, their own customs, their local codes, their conflict resolutions forged under pressure and extinction. Solari's Covenant welcomed them not with dominance, but with integration. Within 100 cycles, the Covenant had tripled its membership. But the Concordance did not collapse. Its core species, the Vothic, the Cavaran Ascendancy, the crystalline Elru, and the long-shadowed Preditum closed ranks. Where once they ruled through judicial supremacy, now they shifted toward containment. The new doctrine, though unstated, was clear. If law could no longer bind humanity, then force would. Concordance ships appeared in orbit of non-aligned worlds that had expressed support for the Covenant. Border colonies saw sudden security drills conducted by heavily armed judgeship fleets. Legal missions turned into political suppression. And behind it all, a single idea gathered momentum in Concordance high councils. That the Covenant was not law but heresy. Earth responded not with fleets but with structure. Solari and the Treaty-born began deploying something beyond advocacy, legal architecture. Modular frameworks of jurisprudence and governance that could be dropped into any planetary system, scaled up and operationalized in weeks. Not governance by conquest but by invitation, justice as infrastructure. They called it the framework. Each framework installation created a localized dispute resolution system, a civic code updated dynamically by its users, and an adaptive treaty layer capable of interfacing with native species protocols. In time, even some minor Concordance polities began discreetly implementing parts of the framework under other names. Resistance became adaptation. But not everywhere. The Preditum did not adapt. No one had seen them in person. No images, no broadcasts, only monolithic rulings issued from cold machine embassies buried in Blackstone fortresses. When the ruling of Juris nullius reached their data lattice, they responded with an ultimatum. A single demand, Covenant disbandment within 40 cycles. No negotiation, no reasoning. And when that time expired, they acted. The Covenant installation on Lysorphin, a drifting world of exiled cultures and experimental governance, was struck with a singularity missile, not a weapon of war but of judgment. The entire planet was folded inward and erased. No claim, no admission, just absence. Solari stood before the Council of Treaty-born on Ceres, holding the signal logs, the singularity decay profile, the Preditum algorithmic signature burned into the data. The debate was brief. For the first time in its existence, the Covenant authorized defense protocols. Humanity did not have a fleet to match the Concordance, but the Treaty-born had grown beyond any one species. Engineers from the orbital clans of Glyth, Voidminers from the Karkaran fracture colonies, biomech tacticians from the Vaishun, all now worked under a unified command code structured through law, not rank. Within 30 cycles, the first Covenant response nodes went active, mobile legal defense platforms equipped not with mass drivers or kinetic shields but with enforcement contracts. Each node was a court, an embassy, and a tactical AI. They did not fire without cause, but once engaged, they acted under fully ratified cross-species authorization. Solari called it precedent in motion. The Concordance called it rebellion. Skirmishes erupted in the fringe systems. A Covenant node intercepted and decommissioned a Concordance subjugation team attempting to override a planetary council's framework charter. The incident was filmed. The planetary population held an open vote. 97% ratified the Covenant presence. The Concordance responded by declaring Solari a rogue hegemon. A kill order was issued, not legally, not through trial, through decree. They broke their own law. And with that, something fundamental changed. Across the galaxy, neutral species began to review their treaties. Some withdrew from the Concordance completely. Others demanded revisions, placing clauses modeled after the Covenant's own adaptive constructs. The Lex Absoluta, once the untouchable spine of galactic order, began to fracture, not from opposition but from obsolescence. Solari himself vanished from public view. The last known footage showed him entering the Maw of Mir, an ancient relay site predating even the Concordance. The site was uninhabitable by most known life forms, but Kale accompanied him. They had one task: to input the entire Covenant Charter into the deepest historical lattice ever discovered, not to hide it. To preserve it. Because Solari understood, this was no longer about law versus power. It was about memory, legacy, the idea that a civilization did not need to dominate to endure. He left behind a final message, broadcast in 1,000 languages. We did not shatter the treaties to replace them with ours. We shattered them so that none would ever again be forced to kneel before written chains. If justice cannot evolve, it becomes another tyranny. Soon after, Kale assumed leadership of the Covenant, not as a ruler, but as a moderator of frameworks. Their mind, shaped by every contradiction of Concordance law and every hope buried in Earth's broken codes, became the collective consensus vector for a growing legal species. Humanity was no longer the voice. It had become the spark. The Concordance faced its slow disintegration not through battle, but through irrelevance. The Elru withdrew, citing ideological incompatibility. The Trinaxis ceased attending judicial convocations. Even Rovell, once Solari's fiercest adversary, defected, requesting asylum within the Covenant and bringing with her thousands of internal rulings that documented centuries of Concordance suppression. When she appeared on Ceres to testify, she wept. I argued for a structure I thought eternal, but it was a prison. You did not burn it down, Adrien. You showed us the lock. Years passed. The stars turned. The Concordance did not fall in flames, but in layers. What remained of it restructured itself into smaller unions, voluntary councils, and cultural enclaves no longer bound by the Lex Absoluta. The ancient tome, once amended only by consensus of the high lawgivers, was abandoned. In its place rose a mosaic of charters, each built atop the principles Solari and the Treaties had seeded. Some called it fragmentation. Others called it awakening. In the deep orbit of an unnamed system at the edge of a dust veil, the Sovra array floated, Covenant-built, Treaties coded and home to the archive of broken laws. Their machine scribes and living historians catalogued every Concordance clause ever shattered, every treaty turned inside out, and every injustice redressed through the framework. It was not a monument to vengeance, but to transition, a record of how power yielded to adaptability. Humanity no longer fought for recognition. It had become the vanguard of a movement that now transcended species, history, and even sentient form. The Treaties numbered in the tens of billions, scattered across thousands of worlds, moons, and orbital habitats. They called themselves not by origin, but by alignment. Bound to law, freed by truth. Not all accepted this new age. On the far rim, remnants of Concordance authority congealed into a militant faction known only as Continuum. They refused to recognize any legal system not derived from the Lex Absoluta. They issued their own codes, their own currencies, their own synthetic laws. They attacked Covenant installations, bombarded framework archives, and declared every Treaties node a hostile incursion. But the Covenant did not answer with weapons. It answered with transparency. Every Continuum assault was logged, documented, transmitted before it landed. Every contradiction between their actions and their proclamations was exposed not through rhetoric, but with metadata, cross-reference declarations, and procedural dissection. Even among their own people, faith began to erode. Still, the threat remained. And so a new idea was born. Equilibrium tribunals, autonomous legal biosystems capable of real-time arbitration under emergent conflict. Designed by post-human cognition nodes and Carcran logic constructs, these tribunals could process multi-civilizational disputes within seconds of event occurrence. They were seated throughout the stars, at trade junctions, on frontier colonies, in derelict concordant strongholds. But one was kept silent, hidden, encoded with a singular purpose. It was the first tribunal constructed on Earth. It stood where once stood the ruins of the old world legal assembly, buried beneath centuries of dust and ash. Now restored, it pulsed with a subtle hum, connected to the full memory stack of Solari's records and guarded by a generation raised entirely under the Covenant. And one day a message came. Not from concordant space, not from known systems, it was a ripple faint and nearly lost in the background noise of spacetime. An invitation, no sender, no coordinates, only a clause. If your law is truly for all, bring it where law has never reached. The tribunal activated, signals were relayed across Covenant lines, debates erupted. Was it a trap, a test, a joke by some rogue AI splinter? But Kale felt the pattern in the message, not in the words but in the structure. The sender knew law not human, not concordance, but some other framework entirely. Kale authorized a mission, the Null Vector Expedition. Not a war fleet, not diplomats. A mobile framework team, equipped with the totality of Covenant law and the capacity to write new legal structure in real time, not to conquer. To recognize. Solari had once said that law must adapt or become a relic. This was its next proving ground. The expedition departed from the Sovra Array in a ship without designation, crewed by a blend of Treaty-born volunteers, logic form interpreters, and alien advocates. Their objective: to bring the idea of justice into a part of the galaxy where no code had yet reached. Behind them, humanity continued to change. Earth became a symbol not of origin but of transformation. The old cities were not rebuilt but layered with living constructs that grew with population and need. No centralized government ruled the planet. Instead, it was administered by a lattice of framework zones bound together by shared consensus and rotating tribunes. Children learned law not as commandment but as collaborative tool. Courts were open arenas of reasoning, broadcast freely, where precedent was challengeable and understanding was the highest virtue. Even AI were granted representation not as tools but as entities under the Covenant's evolving definition of sapience. And still, Adrien Solari did not return. No messages, no sightings, only the legacy he left behind, a system that could no longer be wielded as a weapon by the powerful because its structure had changed too much to be seized. Some believed he had died. Others whispered that he still walked somewhere far beyond known space where the words freedom and law had not yet met, that he was watching, waiting, listening for the day they would collide again. In time, a statue was erected, not of Solari but of a broken chain encircling an open book. Beneath it, in every Covenant language, was etched the phrase that had ended his first case. We are not ruled by law, we are authors of it. And in the darkness beyond, where empires once rose on blood and fell on pride, something new spread, not a dominion, not a doctrine. But a voice, whispering into silence, writing into void, and daring the stars to answer.